So we have had consultations with elders and their representatives already in Northwest Territories. And we have several participants in the course, in fact, who are from First Nations. The individual science teams have, this is a very big project. We have something like 60 teams and maybe 400 scientists that are involved right now. And we actually have a good example. Is Sarah still in the audience? Sarah, where are you? You want to stand up for a second? So Sarah Cooley is a graduate student with one of the investigators, and her project will specifically be working with people in communities. I don't know if you want to say anything about what your plans are. I didn't really mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah, so I am working with my PI, his name is Larry Smith, and we're doing research up here looking at surface water elevation of lakes. We're particularly interested in understanding the hydrology of the region. But we're also lucky that as part of the project we have a citizen science grant to partner with schools and to build citizen science kits that we can distribute to schools both here in the Northwest Territories and also ideally in Alaska in order for us to both help spread our knowledge about our research to the communities, but also to encourage participation so that we're not just scientists who are flying in and doing research, but we're also trying to make sure that people on the ground are involved.
Also in Alaska, there are several of our projects that have specific interviewing and observations from hunters who are, using the game trails and that kind of thing, and reporting as part of the science. I don't know if you had anything else to put in with that.
Yeah, we didn't mention it, but wildlife migration and habitat are another part of above that's really critical. So for instance, the caribou or the waterfowl or even robin migratory patterns are essential parts of what we're trying to understand. So how are these being impacted by the changes that the environment is levying on the ecosystems?
One of the investigators has new satellite transmitters with GPS that are about this big that they are actually putting onto robins. Yes. And
she made Space Robin t-shirts.
Yeah.
Very cool. And then they have names like Pepperoni Pizza and Joe, and what are some of the other?
There's a third grade class in New York that got to name the robins. So,
so each tagged robin has its own name. I don't know how it's contributing to the agreements per se, but our Canadian colleagues have just recently received a very large cold water regions research grant. It's some $75 million Canadian that will be partitioned amongst a consortium of 5 or 6 different universities, and will be research conducted over the next 10 years. And so that's a big, big component of what's going on. And it's mostly focused on the Mackenzie River Valley. So from Trail Valley, where we showed up near Inuvik, all the way south through Scotty Creek. And they're looking at the changes in not only water flow during the times of year, but also in snow and snow water equivalents and snow properties during the cold season.
Andrew, do you know anything specific about that? While Andrew's composing a brilliant answer, I will point out that all of the data that we're taking from satellites, from aircraft, and the work that we fund that's done on the ground is shared with everyone in the world. So certainly the Canadian scientists who are part of the team, but all the data will end up on public-facing, NASA data archives for use of anyone who cares to use it.
Yeah. And Andrew, well, I'm sure everyone in the room knows who you are. Maybe for the people who might be watching this online or in the recording, can you say who you are and why you are expert in answering this question?
Thanks. So yeah, it's a good question. Transboundary water and the need for data to feed the various decisions that will be made over the years regarding water coming into the territory from our neighboring jurisdictions. Part of the reason we were excited to start talking to NASA and the science teams working with NASA was we saw the real potential for data acquisition in the future being derived from remote sensing technologies, which were, I don't know if it's fair to say, Chip and Peter, that these are still emerging technologies, but the applications for them in this part of the world are certainly just emerging now. So as we're probably aware, anybody who's worked here long enough and been in the field here, so I'm sure, as I look around the room, some people certainly are well aware of how expensive it is to put crews into the field with the kind of equipment that's needed to quantify water flow and permafrost condition and groundwater flow and that kind of thing. We've developed, I think, some strategic partnerships with Canadian scientists, the people who operate those carbon flux towers and those remote camps, in 3 regions in this territory, the North Slave, Inuvik, and Decho. And we're endeavoring to work with them to extend the number of carbon flux towers and long-term monitoring sites, and really take advantage of the power of these emerging technologies and this new application to stitch together those remote locations to give us a better picture of the overall relationship between water, energy, and habitat. We have a sort of a run-and-gun series of 9 or 10 priorities when it comes to carbon and climate and people and communities and wildlife in this territory. And between a fairly large number of principal investigators and sort of peripheral investigators, some of them aren't directly funded by Canada or us or their academic funding sources to work under the auspices of above, they're certainly working on related issues that can feed into sort of critical decision points. Things like transboundary water negotiations, things like making decisions about infrastructure design, maintenance, things like that a number of departments and divisions within GNWT really have long-term need for hard data.
Andrew, when you're speaking, you remind me that there are challenges not only in getting to these remote sites, but in making measurements around the annual cycle. And many of the field researchers and research teams really take it easy, if you will, and go out only between April and May and say September, and then most of the rest of the year remains largely unmeasured because A, it's harder to make measurements when things are really cold and all the instrumentation is breaking and the batteries won't work because they're too cold, so you don't have any power.
And the people are miserable.
And the people are miserable. And B, there is this canonical wisdom that nothing is happening once the snow falls and everything freezes. But you all know that a lot is happening during the cold season, and the system hasn't completely shut down. And so we're very interested in understanding and expanding our knowledge of what's happening in the cold season, particularly what we call the shoulder seasons that are kind of being encroached upon. So the October, November, December early cold season, and the March, April, May late cold season or early spring thaw transition. And so those periods seem to be changing quite rapidly as well, and understanding how that impacts the rest of the year is really important.
Was also your question also made me think to mention that some of these practical matters fall within ecosystem services. So water availability, water supply is very much one of these ecosystem services question. This is a 10-year project that we're in year 2 of, and what we funded so far has really focused on ecosystem dynamics. as planned. That's been the plan. And in a solicitation for proposals that should occur in the next probably year and a half, there is the plan calls for more of a focus on the kinds of ecosystem services questions. So we may very well address this important topic, more rigorously in that next round. How hard is it to get everybody to agree how a stew should be cooked? How many recipes are there for rhubarb pie? Right? It is very challenging. It's one of the nice things actually about working with the National Park Service in Alaska is that there are a whole, in the national parks, there's a series of sampling sites that have a defined protocol. And it's different than what the U.S. Forest Service has for their sites. So they have another set of protocols. And you know what? The Canadian Forest Service and the permanent sampling plots, there's another set of protocols. They can be intercompared and intercalibrated. And in the case of these mission agencies, that have specific instruction to conduct the monitoring, they're not going to change the protocol. Right? These are things that are very well established over, in some cases, many decades. So it is part of the challenge of doing the research is to create seamless data products that don't show boundaries between territories and provinces and the international boundary with Alaska, because we know that the trees don't have that boundary. So that is one of the goals. And in some of the sampling, for instance, because Andrew, it is very fair to say that these were emerging technologies. So with the radar aircraft, the team of scientists right now are in fact scrambling to come up with agreed upon protocols for soil moisture measurements, for instance.
We have another question.
My question is might be a dumb question, but this is a pretty cool project, and I just want to know why really it's here and why it's important that you.
Having been coming to the North now for, this is my second decade of doing intensive research up here. As I mentioned earlier, the North is kind of the bellwether for the entire Earth. Things are happening here first. They're happening here in larger magnitude, so it's easier to see the big changes that are going on. And the systems, the trees, the forests, the tundra are much more sensitive to even small changes than systems are elsewhere in the world. And so we're able to see a magnified response from the system, and that helps us learn about the rest of the Earth. Also, this part of the world, again, because the environment is so harsh and brutal, logistics are very, very difficult. There are few communities that you can use as centers of operations around the Pan-Arctic. And so the data are sparse in both space and time. So it's a very, very undersampled part of the world. And we need to know more about what's going on in this very, very critical region that seems to be changing faster than any place else. So there's a real urgency for doing this now before even more change takes place.
And the things that are happening here, as important as they are to your daily lives, have repercussions to the south, whether people realize it or not. And what's happening in the north is not staying in the north, whether it's through bird migrations, birds that are essential to ecosystems as across the Americas and all the way to the Antarctica.
Changes in the jet stream and mid-latitude weather patterns.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, the feedback of CO2 and methane from thawing permafrost, which is the big carbon climate question for this area that matters to everybody.
It's the 800-pound polar bear in the room,
Yeah.
or 400-kilo polar bear in the room here.
The part of NASA that we fall under is actually the carbon cycle and ecosystems focus area. So NASA Earth Science is divided up into a number of different focus areas. Some of you may have heard of Ice Bridge, which is studying the Arctic Ocean ice and the ice caps of Greenland and Antarctica. So different focus area than ours. So for an organization whose job it is to understand how life on Earth works and what the prospects are for us in a changing world, the carbon cycle is very, very important. So it gets to be in the title.
Tell them about the currency.
Yes, yeah. Carbon is the money. Carbon is the currency of the biosphere. And we follow how it moves from the atmosphere into plants, from plants into animals, and from plants and animals back into the atmosphere through respiration and decay. So that carbon cycle is just the fundamental way of measuring what's happening in living organisms of all kinds.
All right, so this is actually my area of expertise, and the simple answer is we don't know, because there's so little data or information that the uncertainties are large, and they're large enough that it could be a small to moderate absorber of carbon, or the Arctic could be a small to moderate emitter of carbon on a net basis. And what our most recent research suggests is that while we're seeing this so-called Arctic greening, which is the tundra becoming more productive and having more shrubs than it used to have and taking up more carbon through photosynthesis, we're also seeing the impacts of longer and warmer thaw seasons and less brutally cold early cold seasons, so that the microbial respiration, the decomposition of this carbon, is actually outpacing the carbon uptake. And this is a point of contention and really an area of intense current research, but it looks like the Arctic is shifting from being a long-term accumulator of carbon, right? It used to be too cold and too wet for that carbon that was taken up to really be decomposed. But now it looks like things have warmed enough, and particularly in what we would call the early cold season, where the surface is frozen and snow covered, but the subsurface, 10 or 20 centimeters down, remains thawed well into November and December. You still have microbial decomposition taking place. It's releasing carbon dioxide and methane to the atmosphere, and that extended early season non-thawed period in the subsurface is counterbalancing everything that happened in the growing season, and the area is turning into a net source of carbon to the atmosphere before the permafrost thaws on a large scale basis. And so this is what has many of the scientific community concerned, because once the permafrost really thaws, then there are billions and billions of tons of carbon that are potentially available for this release, not just the carbon near the surface or in the trees.
We have another question.
So we have we have been very fortunate so far. So I'll have that cautionary. But NASA has enjoyed bipartisan support for many, many decades. And our mission as a honest broker of science done with the highest integrity is something that is, I think, cherished by people who work for NASA. And it's explicit even in our in the guidance for scientific integrity that NASA gives to its to its employees. And I have not seen that challenged. We'll cross that if it happens. But the current budget as proposed by the president is, the term is the president proposes and the Congress disposes. So Congress is the one that actually makes the budget, and we have not seen the congressional budget yet. So we shall see. But in the long, in an overview, NASA Earth Science has a budget of $1.9 billion a year, and the president's budget had about $100 million cut to NASA Earth Science in it. In the current environment, that is very, very good. I mean, in almost any environment. I mean, when you've got almost $2 billion a year to work with, you are very thankful every day that you go in to work, right?
Yeah, let me just reiterate that the mandate for NASA as a science and technology agency is to provide the highest quality, objective information to people making decisions. So we do our best job to make sure that the information we provide are as accurate as possible, that any uncertainties associated with these data are also characterized as well as we can, and to provide, again, that information so that people whose job it is to make political decisions are more informed when they make those decisions.
And that includes the citizens of the U.S. and of the world.
It goes from the local level up to the highest government levels, and even into the international United Nations framework conventions and other international agreements that are negotiated and agreed to.
I mean, there are a few of the projects. NASA had funded some pre-above science that's that's already available. Chip was the lead of a very important carbon reservoir project that has some very high-profile papers that are already out. And we're in the second year of funding for the first round of funding for this, this core effort. And there are papers here and there that are coming out, but I would expect, over in the next year or so, for that first round of projects to be publishing papers.
Yeah. So one of the great things about NASA and its science is that the Earth Science Data Policy mandates that within 12 months of acquisition that we deliver all of the data in a thoroughly analyzed, quality-controlled, calibrated, validated version to a public archive that anyone can access. So if you have an internet connection, you can get online and you can find where the above data are stored. You can pull all of them if you choose to. You can pull some of them. And so it's a 1 year from time of acquisition. So data are already in the archive for some of the early above projects. That said, we're working as scientists to analyze these data and understand what they mean. And with this kind of study, the longer term records, the longer that some of these records grow, the more powerful the information becomes, and the more we're able to drill into certain scientific questions. So while we get some early initial insights, I expect that the largest understanding and breakthroughs from above science will come 5 or 7 years from now. And if you look at past long-term experiments that we've run, it's actually about 3 to 5 years after the 10-year experiment has been run or the 5-year experiment has been run when the peak of all these publications comes out. Because you have people working to gather the data, to make changes to what they're doing based on what they're learning as they go along. But then it's not until you have everything and can really sit down and look at it and understand it, talk with your colleagues, expose it to others at conferences or in discussions, that you really begin to understand what you have in this trove. We're here this week and tonight exactly to help people understand what Above is about, what some of the information is that we'll be gathering, and how it might be useful. You saw some of the flight lines, the places that we're going to fly and collect data. Many of those are informed and, in fact, almost dictated by similar discussions we've had over the past several years with Andrew and his colleagues, with other members of the GNWT, with people from the Yukon territories, and other Canadians. Those spots on the ground really guide our thinking, what people have been doing in the past, and also such local priorities as the hydropower or what's happening with the boundary waters, right, between, say, Alberta and the Northwest Territories along the Slave River. These are all really important questions at a societal level, and we're trying to bring the focus of our scientific magnifying glasses through these various tools to understand these things and pass along what information we can to help either improve the situations or to help alter some of the thinking that might be going on if it were maybe not optimal.
Mm-hmm. Our scientific collaborators are an essential part of that. Chip mentioned GNWT, but like in Alaska, for instance, we have scientists from the land management agencies who are part of the project. They are science team members, and they will bring this. They've really directed a lot of our focus to questions that are of importance to the Park Service or to the Fish and Wildlife Service for the lands that they are responsible for. They'll bring that back into their community engagement, and they have actual management and regulatory responsibilities that this work will inform. On a more kind of general level, NASA's Office of Communications is covering what this project and a lot of the projects that NASA has around the world through what they call Earth expeditions. You can follow NASA Earth on Facebook if you're into that sort of thing. The Earth Observatory is another website that gets millions of views a month. I think NASA Earth on Facebook has something like 9 million likes, the people who are following it. So there's a level of public profile that our colleagues in the Office of Communications bring. And we're also attracting attention from documentary type folks. Chip is already a star on HBO Vice, and we've got a Discovery Channel producer who's doing a piece on this, National Geographic, PBS Nova. So there's a lot of of press attention. And CBC in Yellowknife interviewed Chip today too, so we're...
And in fact, you know, we realize that we can't do everything, but part of the formal arrangements that NASA has made with Above are to team with Polar Knowledge Canada, and to team with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and to team with GNWT and the Canadian Forestry Service, and various other universities and consortia. And we are relying on them and their networks and their connections out into the various communities to help spread the word about what we're all trying to do here in the North. And so it really is a team effort.
We come to places like this, you know, seriously, you know, we have to get out of our planes and our labs and our offices and talk to folks like you.
Yeah, so there's no question within the scientific community what the consensus is. It's 98, 99% on one side and 1%-ish on the other side. And the 1% who are in denial or have controverting arguments compared to the overwhelming evidence that's been established, they're getting, I would say, a disproportionate amount of airtime or press or recognition for being these outstanding voices. And one of the things that we learn in doing these big projects, especially I come from the satellite world, and we're always making decisions on incomplete information and having to make risk-reward assessments. And I think that's the kind of thinking that needs to go into this now. We don't have to have 100% certainty to take action and to begin mitigating or adapting to things that are already happening. There's no need for that. And the bar that the scientists put on themselves is perhaps too high when going into these kind of different discussions. And scientists have a very, very different set of discussions in and amongst themselves about how confident you are in a certain result or what is the uncertainty of a certain result. And we argue and bicker back and forth to the outside world. That may look like we have no consensus and don't understand a thing about what's going on, which is very, very far from the real truth. And so I think there needs to be some more effective communication and messaging that relates the real overwhelming weight of the evidence in many aspects of this climate change issue. The altitude is going to be about 12 kilometers, and that's a trade-off. The lower we fly, the more tighter the spatial resolution is, but the narrower the swath is. It's a fixed field of view. So by going up to about 12 kilometers, we get the best compromise between wide-scale coverage and spatial resolution. So from 12 kilometers, we'll get 12 to 15 kilometers of swath width with about a 5 to 6 meter resolution, depending on the different frequencies of radar that we're using. Okay. So for those who are unfamiliar with the GRACE mission, GRACE is a gravity mission. It was initially designed it's 2 satellites that fly in not quite lockstep, but they're flying together in constellation. There is a microwave beam that's passed back and forth between them, and by doing very, very accurate measurements of the time it takes the microwave beam to go from one satellite to the other, they know the distance between the 2 satellites. And as they fly around the world, they're closer together or further apart, depending on the gravitational field. And so what they do is they use these very, very fine scale distance measurements. They're making measurements. These satellites are approximately 300 kilometers apart, and they're making the distance difference measurement down to a sub-micron level. So less than the width of your human hair is how closely they're able to measure that. And by doing those measurements, they get very, very fine scale measurements of the gravitational field of the Earth. Now, the gravitational field of the Earth has a fixed basic component to it, which is how the mass is distributed. But water, which is actually relatively heavy, moves around. And so you can actually follow the flow of water across seasons. When it rains or snows, so it snows up here, you get an accumulation over the land surface. When there's the thaw, that water melts, becomes liquid, and then flows out into the rivers, into the Arctic Ocean, into the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans, and circulates around again. And you can actually see the differences in the gravity associated with the changes in these water masses. Now, to get to something as fine scale as, say, the Slave Basin is a little bit beyond what I understand that they can do currently. But around the Arctic, they can look at the Mackenzie River Basin, or the Yukon Basin, or the Kolma Basin, or the Ob or Lena Basins. And so they're looking at the major river basins around the Arctic. The last set of stuff we talked about was dividing the Arctic into like 8 or 9 different regions. And so the Slave is just a little bit too small, but you can actually see the flow of water in these major river basins. And the data from the 12 or 13 years of GRACE are now showing measurements that are commensurate with what we get from the water stations. So you're seeing increased flow over time, and you're seeing especially increased flow during the cold season, during the nominal frozen season. And so these are both things that we believe are related to the thawing of permafrost. And so we're beginning to see the linkages between hydrology or water flow and what's happening with the land surface, in that when the permafrost begins to thaw, the ice wedges that were trapped in the permafrost now melt and then can move out and vacate where they previously were. And we think that that's part of this overall amplification. Great question, thank you.
And just wanted to add to that, in the frozen parts, so this satellite can weigh the total amount of ice that's on top of Greenland, for instance. It's small, fine enough scale that it can get the coastal glaciers of Alaska, for instance, like the total amount. I don't think it resolves any individual ones, but it can get on the scale of the the glaciated parts of Alaska, and of course Antarctica. We weigh the amount of ice on top of Antarctica and see what the trends are there.
Yeah. So just to continue on in a complete, in this tangent about ice and GRACE, the first measurements of GRACE showed much more ice mass loss over Greenland than anyone could account for. And the scientists sat around scratching heads, trying to figure out what was going on. There were all these campaigns to measure the ice cap and figure out what was going on. And it wasn't until someone said, well, what's happening underneath the ice? And they realized that water was flowing out from underneath, which was something that no one had thought about before. It wasn't in any of the models or calculations. Mm-hmm. And now, by capturing both the flow from on top of the ice surface and underneath the ice cap on Greenland, we're beginning to get measurements, we're beginning to get analyses that agree with these large-scale GRACE measurements and other measurements that we're making. And so
close that budget.
And so these new technologies lead us to dark corners and places that we don't understand, but out of that comes new levels of understanding and things that people just hadn't previously thought about before. And so this is the real exciting and astonishing part of science, the part that keeps us all continually awed like a bunch of little kids. Yeah. And the reason we keep coming back to do this day after day, month after month, year after year.
And there's actually a field campaign going on now in Greenland called OMG. That's Oceans Melting Greenland. They have a funnier acronym than we do.
The northwestern corner of Greenland and the very top of the Canadian archipelago are thought to be the last bastions of old multi-year ice, when ice around the rest of the Arctic Ocean will probably become what we would call seasonal, or like 1 to 3 year ice. And so there won't be the massive ice flow over the top of the North Pole in the not too distant future. It'll all melt back and then refreeze during the winter and melt back and refreeze. And so you'll have a seasonally ice-free Arctic Ocean, which is something that has not happened in any of our lifetimes. The current rate, if I'm going to get this number right, in the 1990s, the rate of sea level rise was something on the order of 1 millimeter per year. In the 2000s, it went up to about 3 millimeters per year. And I don't know what the newest number is. We'd have to ask Josh, who's the PI of OMG, who's the world's expert in ice melting, sea level rise. But I think it's still continuing to rise in this kind of geometric fashion. And so it's accelerating with time. And a millimeter per year or 3 millimeters per year, it sounds minuscule, but when you start to accumulate these types of changes, especially if they continue to accelerate, there's now the threat that there might be something in the neighborhood of 1 meter of sea level rise by 2100. And now you're talking about places within 50 kilometers of the coast that currently exist being submerged. Those are places like Miami and New Orleans, but in the developing world, it's even worse. And so Bangladesh, the majority of Bangladesh would go submerged, right? They don't have a relatively high sea level. And if you think that 1 million or 2 people out of the Middle East is a serious refugee crisis, wait until a few 100 million people from South Asia are looking for a new home. That's going to be some serious social and political impact.
And this is one of the reasons why the U.S. Military is one of the firm, recognizing the clear and present danger that climate change poses to national security. So they're quite clear about where they stand on that. So the reinsurance companies particularly they're well over a decade into factoring climate change into their, reinsurance companies are the ones that insure the insurance companies. And these are, trillion-dollar bets that they're making, and they take it extremely seriously. Munich Re is one of the reinsurance companies that has reports that are pretty, relatively easy to read for the general audience. So I'd encourage people to look those up.
Thank you.